Now we're going to get started. Let me ask this very easy question at the beginning. It leaves a lot open. Yesterday, to close out, what is important to you as leaders of the workshop? We'll start with you, Stephan. What is the most urgent? What was perhaps the core of your work? Oh, I'd love to. We had two special topics, KSK and a possible unemployment insurance. But KSK took so much time, and at the end of the time we only had 10 minutes left. And our second topic, without going too deeply into the details, I would like to make one point, which is of extreme importance for all 3 points that I discussed with Anne in the second workshop. The question of the minimum fee limit and the question of what is paid and what standards and what fees are paid for what work. It's of critical importance for the entire topic. And if we were, maybe not an ideal world, but a better world, if we had better fee standards that were more oriented to the realities of every day, then we'd have a bunch of questions. For example, how do we treat production managers in the KSK? Or, for example, for old age pension positions, what everyone earns in the projects, then, so to speak, we would have solved a lot of projects. Oh, excuse me, can I? What do you mean by in another world? Well, let me give you a brief example. Dach Berlin, that is a collection of music associations in Berlin. Recently, finally, you can almost say, they've finally managed to agree on a minimum fee limit across the different genres. And what is the working practice? The daily rate is 630 euros, but it's oriented towards the bottom, towards the poverty limit. And it really doesn't take into account what goes in before and after the project. We certainly can't transfer this to every single discipline. There's a special focus on music. But it shows you, if you look there and you do the accounting, then you come to different totals than we have now. But there's a large number of detail problems. This is why we're in a non-ideal world. For example, the question, in jazz, there's a bunch of projects that are partially funded. There's public funding in there, but also sponsors and other amounts. What do you do? Well, you can break the standard, but then the projects are going to have a large problem. Because the sponsors and other funders, they can't keep up, for example. And now maybe we need to go a little bit slower towards this ideal world, but Anna, expansion of the KSK, was that a topic that a lot of people wanted to talk about? With us, actually, no. We left the topic of KSK by Stephan, and we dedicated ourselves to other topics.
Wirklich zuvorderst da genannt werden kann als unbedingt anzugehendes Themenfeld ist die Definitionsnotwendigkeit.
And we wanted to talk about what exactly independent work means. We talked a lot about legal insecurities, employment law. Employment law works differently than tax law, works differently than social law. And there's a very, very urgent need for conversations with a look towards working realities. And we want to make sure that there's a regular updating with these themes, and this was a core topic. Okay, thanks. We talked a little bit about that yesterday evening, the topic of a criteria catalog, working realities, a catalog criteria for the COSCA. Maybe you could talk about that for a moment? Sure. I think that really affects a huge number of fields. Even in the words of greeting this morning, I continue to hear about the gaps between working practice and the legal system, and you continually find yourself moving in gray areas, and you can't really do anything else. You simply have no means of acting. You can't formally employ people if the funding sums are insufficient to do so. It's a vicious cycle. Trying to also remove the complexity from these films. And the studies are certainly a first and excellent point to begin working and say, okay, I'm going to name where the problem is, and this is exactly where we should start. That's what you mean by making things somewhat clear, yes? Well, maybe you could even use a nicer word, reality, realism. There are two very important big keywords. One is insurance for citizens, the other a universal basic income without conditions. These are exciting concepts that a lot of us have in our heads that would also solve a great number of problems. But there's no political majorities for these systems. You've got to take a look at this with a certain amount of realism and say what is in fact possible. And to move back to this doc example that I gave earlier, it's important to move now and not simply wait for an ideal sum. And I think there's an urgency to be realistic and to have a bit of a realpolitik approach to your thoughts. But I think it also helps us yet right now to think what's possible right now. And with this in mind, System Check is a wonderful way to work with academic expertise, with studies, and to ask specific, with these specific, concrete, quantitative studies, to use these to find a recommendation for action that you can stand behind. Anna, you asked before, what topics were left with you, and with the academics and the presentation of the results, this is where we left off yesterday. There are solo independent workers, there are hybrid realities.
Kann man das der Politik eigentlich, oder wie, das ist sonst zu offen, wie kann man das denn eigentlich
How can you bring this into a unified format for the politicians to deal with? What is that exactly? What is independent work as an entrepreneur, as a freelancer? And we heard yesterday that there are a great number of hybrid forms in very different ways. We could call it multi-jobbing. Would you perhaps work with various levels, or okay? We could discuss this with the others in the panel as well, I think. What is urgently necessary? It's very clear to us how complex the situation is, also with a look to the Künste Sozialkasse. Where can I work? without endangering my membership within the KSK. That's very clear to us. But for some other people, all of these challenges are not so present. So this is why I always ask myself, how do we manage? And that's why yesterday was interesting. As society overall, how can we deal with things so simply that they make mastering the complexity possible? Okay. And then another question that stayed with me was this topic of overall society, the different typologies. Yesterday, we saw that there are very careful and cautious types of people who are less concerned, and then people who are more concerned. But in terms of overall society, they're also there. Is that perhaps an opportunity that we can find these types of people in overall society who would react, for example, to the keyword qualification, and they would want to work with continuing education, strengthening, helping members of the community to come along? That's a two-part question. Okay, well, I'm not sure I'm going to answer the question, but I would like to say we have particular solutions like the KSK that we don't want to question, but the opening remark, if we did have basic insurance for citizens, if we would think about that, how would we deal with independent freelance work? Well, you could certainly solve a lot of problems that end up in the individual areas if you think about it like that. But at the moment, there's emergency solutions. I'd like to encourage us through this example. Yesterday, perhaps we all saw the message that the so-called Citizens Geld or Universal Basic Income that we agreed on yesterday, we know it could have looked very differently, but they didn't agree. And there's a detailed solution. And now the assets have been shortened to 40,000 euro, and then you think, oh, well, they sunk the quota. But if reserves are formed that go beyond this 40,000, for example, for old age pension provisions, and that remains untouched, I think that's an important success of lobbying work that happened during the coronavirus pandemic period, because this is primarily about freelancers who have exactly this problem. And now they've ended up in a solution. But this lobbying work that we do and that System Check can do for us, we can find approaches for solutions for the general public. Okay. Well, it's true, and there are these hidden things in there. I might ask you later, but the lobbying work, that's a great keyword. Anna? Could you perhaps take the closing word here, because we're going to bring in our additional guests? Thinking of lobbying work, we talked about this yesterday. What levels do you work with lobbying work? How do we have our overall positions get closer to each other? What is the long-term strategic goal of the lobbying work? Where can we start up right now directly? And where do we have to keep working? Maybe you could talk about that and then we'll discuss further? Sure. Okay.
Sehr gerne. Also ich habe mir hier als Quick Wins gestern von Sören und Kaya ja schon zusammengetragen, notiert.
To make the KSK less bureaucratic, with an eye towards earning possibilities and employment, train the trainer formats. I think we can go a little bit more in depth than that, what exactly that means. And then some delimitations covering old age provisions, pension insurance. That does need to go quickly. But we can start with that in a pretty timely manner. Okay. And that's exactly what we would like to further discuss right now.
Wollen wir jetzt gleich weiter besprechen.
Und das zu den Quick Wins. Und du hast aber natürlich auch nach dem großen Bogen gefragt.
I think with the overall picture, going through the entire conference to find solidarity in large associations, looking for good and long-term solutions. There's a solidary approach, and we need solutions for everyone, not simply artists. That has to be a solution. And for example, if an obligatory retirement insurance would come, well, we need to make sure that the fees have to raise as well. Otherwise, it's impossible for the fees to cover these contributions to the insurance, and that would have effects on the funding structures, certainly. I think those are the medium and long term. Okay, let me add one more thing that just came into my mind. We had the topic of education or qualification. And we also talked during the round last evening informally, how quickly can educational institutions change their curricula?
With
the experience in schools, we realized this was tricky right away, but then the topic did arise. It's also qualification. There's also a function of the associations, and they are working on that, but specifically, talking about the needs of KSK, of insurance, and especially young people at the start of their professional careers.
Oft keine Lust haben, mit zu beschäftigen. Das war nämlich der Satz des Abends für mich gestern, dass man sagte, die anderen wissen
and it seems to me that everyone else always know better than we do in art and culture. Well, that's wonderful. Well, you just opened up the second round of questions that we want to discuss. Great. Okay. Support. Oh, please give us a round of applause for the two of you. Now, I would like to welcome Anne-Cathrin Lessel.
Anne-Cathrin Lessel. Sie war ab 2011 Programm- und Produktionsleiterin am Loft. Das
in 2011 began taking on production management at Loft in Leipzig, and now in 2019 became the artistic director and is a board member of the State Association of Independent Arts in Saxony.
Man stolpert immer wieder über ihren Namen, unter anderem bei der Stadt Leipzig, Kulturstiftung des Freistaates Sachsen, der Studienstiftung des Deutschen Volkes und dem Fonds Darstellende Künste. Heute
she has the BFDK hat on. Welcome.
Vorstand. Herzlich willkommen.
Now I want to welcome Lena Krause.
Lena Krause, da ist sie. Sie
she
war
was,
unter anderem
amongst others, a
des Ateliers Neue Musik, der
general manager,
Bremen und Managerin des
and today
Mosaik in Berlin. Heute
she is general manager of FREO, the independent ensemble and orchestras in Germany, and is an expert in theater and music. Today she'll be speaking from the perspective of the spokesperson of the Allianz der Freien Künste. Please give her a round of applause.
Ja, einen Applaus, sorry.
Welcome.
Habe ich durchgehetzt. Herzlichen Dank. Schön, dass du da bist. Dann hatten wir gestern zwei wundervolle
Yesterday we had some really exemplary speakers in the workshops.
Und das waren Sören Fenner und
Kaya, you remember from yesterday morning.
Kaya kennt
she
schon von
gave a
gestern
great
Morgen.
word of greeting,
Sie hat das wundervolle Grußwort
an artistic
gehalten,
performance.
also schon eine künstlerische Performance. Und
And yesterday, Anna, I think,
war gestern bei,
no, she was in the KSK workshop, right? Sorry.
Nee, sie war bei der KSK und Auftragslosenversicherung, sorry.
And she summarized the findings for pensions. Unfortunately, we didn't record that, so we're very happy that the two of them are joining us as well. Please give them a warm round of applause. Well, thanks a lot. Well, you've already sort of opened up the topic, because when looking at the KSK, yesterday we also talked about the question of qualification, and the Federal Association for some time has decided that it wants to provide further education in the organizational areas, as we call it somewhat dryly, and this was added to the topic Künstlersozialkasse. Kaya, I'd like to ask you directly, turn things over to you. What did you discuss yesterday in the workshop? What ideas did you have? I'd love to start.
Ja, ich würde total gerne einsteigen mit einer Unterscheidung von Sören Fenner, die ich jetzt immer wieder zitieren werde, weil ich die so hilfreich finde. Die Unterscheidung zwischen den Verhältnissen und dem Verhalten. Genau. Wenn du noch kurz Credit woanders hingehst.
That's from AXA. Let's give AXA credit for that.
Dann muss ich anfangen, AXA Credit dafür zu geben.
That's so helpful.
Weil ich das so hilfreich
Because
finde.
When we talk about
und wir beschäftigen uns, wenn wir über Qualifizierung.
We don't talk about the conditions.
Ja, auf jeden Fall nicht mit den Verhältnissen.
We talk about our attitude.
Wir beschäftigen uns mit unserem
That's why it's on the quick win list.
Deshalb auf der Liste der
Because
Quick
it's
Wins,
so easier,
weil es so viel
so much easier to change
unser Verhalten zu ändern als das der anderen.
our
Und es liegt in unserem Einflussbereich.
attitude than someone else's. That's good, and we should do that.
Das ist schön
And
das sollten wir auch tun.
I could stop.
Da können wir nicht aufhören. Also sozusagen, dementsprechend würde ich das jetzt ganz kurz halten.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about qualification very long, because the other thing is so much more important because it's structural.
Weil es strukturell ist. Und
the question of how we qualify ourselves,
wie wir uns qualifizieren,
it's also structural, but it's much more individual.
Naja, die ist auch strukturell, aber sozusagen individueller und
and is much more in the personal sphere.
Persönlichen Sphäre.
Oh, and Stephan would like to add something. Yeah, just a tiny addition.
Ich würde nur eine ganz
qualification. Yeah, everybody nods, great.
Man sagt dann so, ja, qualifizieren, nicken alle, super. BMI soll bezahlen, auch schreiben wir mal.
But I think you have to differentiate a little bit more, and you've got to be very, very specific. I think that's a very dangerous half-knowledge, like particularly in terms of KSK, people who are working in the field. You really need to create an information center, and theoretically, you could do that within the framework of this project, System Check. You can certainly examine this point. I think we need to have individual advisement for artists from people with expertise who are very, very, very familiar with the topic, and make sure that we don't have this dangerous half-knowledge underway. And where do we have the contradictions? Where is it better to find legal advice? It's a point, I think, that the associations have to come together, or even the Deutsche Kulturrat or the German Federal Ministry for Labor and Social Issues. They also won't say, oh, that's a great idea. Oh, excuse me, let me jump in, because I would like to hear something from Lena here, how the associations could react together. Would that be a project for the Allianz der Freien Künste? Oh, I just had the impulse to say, what are all the things that the associations could do? But I would like to say, yes, in general, I think that's a great idea. And certainly a project that could take place at Allianz der Freien Künste, where we now have more than 20 federal associations from throughout the entire country and artistic disciplines, because there's immediately this interdisciplinary approach, and you can learn so much with that, and you can make sure that there isn't half knowledge, insufficient knowledge at play. How are things in my discipline? How are things in the other disciplines? And maybe we have to change something because it's already working very well in the other discipline. In general, I could imagine something like that working very well, but I would still like to deal with my very first impulse. Because we also need, in parallel, political reform. We can't simply stay forever in these gray zones with insufficient knowledge, with things that we don't really know, because we are continually moving through gray areas that sometimes work this way and sometimes work that way. And that's why we need to do things in parallel. Political reform on the one hand and advisement on the other, and from, as far as I'm concerned, definitely Allianz der Freien Künste. Okay, now we have a question about the political form for Viren. But first, Kaya wanted to say something. Sure. Qualification is under the banner of use what exists. Use the things that exist as much as the system allows you to do so without overstepping the boundary, but to use it as much as possible, perhaps even more than was thought, and to bring everyone along with you, and that's why people need to qualify themselves. I think that Lena expressed her point very well, and I agree completely. If we do this, if we use the KSK as much as we can, and that's probably the project that you would make, then you would definitely be safeguarding many more people than perhaps we have right now. Okay, I agree, and I also think if we talk about actions, we don't need to play against each other, we can work in parallel. I think that's very important. The same people don't have to do everything, different people have to do it. We need to look, who is involved in all this? This is what we did in Fair Stage. Janina introduced that exceptionally well. We have the political decision makers. Who precisely? The Bundestag, and this, and this, and this, so that we really list everything. And the next step, the authorities. Well, which authorities? And so on and so on. And afterwards you have an enormous list. Okay, now who has to do what? What are the measures that we've identified? And how do we arrange these measures? I think that would be easier for us if we did it then. And I think it's much better than thinking, oh, what else do we have to do right now? It's much better to say, well, we'll do this and they'll do that. I think it's very important. Well, we have to also explain to the politicians a little bit what we want. Well, the politicians have created this a little bit because they've created this and created this problem. Because what exists no longer depicts our working realities. And I would try to make this easier and not have one workaround and another workaround, but instead say, hey, the way this works no longer functions. And since we are role models for overall society, because we tend to be a little bit earlier in our framework conditions, everybody else comes a little afterwards. Thank you very much. Lena has an impulse. And then I wanted to ask Anne-Cathrin, because the Federal Association has dealt with this a lot. Okay. We were just talking about parallelism of political reform and qualification measures, and perhaps conducted by associations. But education is also a topic. I'd like to change this to a trio. It's incredibly important where we need changes. We need changes in the educational institutions. For example, here's a brief example. I work in the independent music community, and I was recently at a 2-day conference where we talked about the changing professional fields for musicians. And if you look, who's appointed professors at academies of music, these are people who often have permanent employment in an orchestra. And then these professors have been employed for 20, 30 years or longer. These are people who don't come from the working realities of freelance work. And they stay at these institutions for a very long time. So these institutions lack the perspective of working realities in the independent community. And I think that's important in the major course of instruction. The primary course of study with the professors who teach the instruments is very, very important. If this important reference person doesn't know what the working realities are in the field, and doesn't make the effort to gain this experience by talking to colleagues, then the perspective for independent work simply isn't given. Yeah. And then the students simply think, well, you have to go and find a permanent position in orchestra. Yep. I would say, too, this is structural. This deals with the issue at its roots. And what do the educational institutions offer? What responsibility do you have when you send people to the market? Because at the end of the day, they are moving in an artistic market. This was a topic Krause came up. Anne-Cathrin, you said as well, educational institutions are an important topic. Yes, I'd like to add what Lena described. And what Lena just described is certainly not only underway in music, it also has to deal with performing arts and theater education. We're going to have to look at the field from a perspective of multiple levels, and the state associations are already providing information and advisement sessions for new members of the community, and all the same, they still don't have this individual detailed knowledge, which is of course also sometimes contradictory. First, there needs to be basic general knowledge, which can come from the state associations and the projects and programs and initiatives. Schneider was part of our big On the Road, and also with the follow-up project background, we're trying to build up knowledge step by step and level by level and to make it accessible, but nevertheless, we still need to deal with this topic of, do we need an information center? Do we need something that's independent from the associations? Is there some kind of outside eye that can look to specific cases and make sure that there's legal conform and legal advisement? That's also a gap. That's something that we're missing. There's no legal advisement. As associations, we can't provide any legally valid advisement. Okay, so it's left to coincidence that to meet a nice advisor somewhere, we need to institutionalize that. And you'd like to go on? Sure. Well, here's a topic about education I'd like to add. With the Allianz, we thought, well, how do we get to the educational institutions? Okay, well, we'll make a demand, then we'll talk to institutional educations. But we know that this is a state issue. As a best practice example, I'd like to talk about the Bundesverband Freie Darstellende Künste, the Federal Association. For years, what's it called? The Konferenz die Schauspielschulen, the Conference of the Acting School, the Ständige Konferenz der Schauspielschulen. They can then approach the instructors from the inside. Because you write a paper full of theses, and now the institutions have to do this, nothing's going to happen. But if you reach the professors at places where they all come together, well, then you can create a different attitude. And I think in the intervening period, particularly in the performing arts, you see that independent work, a lot of people are thinking now, yes, if you don't end up with a spot in the big orchestra, then yes, you can work independently. They finally get it. It's innovative, and it also is a living reality that is attractive to a lot of people because they don't want to work for a large institution. And I think that's important, to work with the system from the inside out, reaching them at central points. I see a lot of nods from the audience. I'd like to add the following. We also heard this, the professional conference for On the Road, because you're talking about formats. Well, there's these moments of exchange where instructors and those who work at institutions, they write the corresponding curricula, they need to be called upon to stay in touch with the practice and the praxis and make sure that what they're preparing the students for corresponds to the realities of life. And people who work independently or as freelancers should also be teaching, should also bring this expertise into the institutional educations. Oh, can I ask something maybe a little bit naively? Are there numbers? Are there studies? How many of the educational institutions, their graduates, how many of them go to permanent employment or to freelance work? I don't think so. That was a question, and unfortunately, no, that doesn't exist. I'd like to make a link to Sören and the Ensemble network.
Dieser Moment, als war, glaube ich, Ende der ersten oder zweiten, wo da junge Schauspielerinnen aufstehen, die sagen, uns hat
there was a minute where young actors stood up and said, hey, nobody told us about this. Please, give us information. So at Junges Ensemble Netzwerk, like from the crowd, someone stood up and said, no one told us about this, and the institutions are there without this feedback, not in their communities. They make a lot of approaches because you really have to start on the inside. You have to reach people on the inside. They have to offer something. Yes, that's true. In this younger generation, there's a much stronger awareness, for example, than was in my generation. There's always this myth of, if you're good, then you'll find good jobs. Ha ha. And as far as that, there is a strong awareness and the desire to be informed. There's also the Career Center at the institutions. It's been around for about 10 years. There's an increasing number of career centers. And I don't think this is a good development. Personally, I would prefer it if this was in the individual departments and courses of studies, so that the students don't see it as an add-on, but see it as a fundamental part of the job. And this would also include not only giving workshops, where of course people have red cheeks because they get so excited and have been given so much information, and yep, and after they think about it for a night, they think, oh, I'll never make that. We need to be able to integrate this. And to do so, we need to let information grow and allow questions to be asked. And we need to have professors who are constantly there and stand as a constant contact partner. Yes, what we really have to talk about right now but first, Kaya. I just wanted to name a figure that I was both shocked and calmed by. A fifth of the people asked in the quantitative study, I'm only working in independent performing arts because I didn't find a job somewhere else.
Das räumt auf jeden Fall mit dem Mythos auf, der sozusagen als ich mich habe ausbilden lassen, noch total präsent war von, wenn du frei bist, dann hast du es nur nicht geschafft.
And I think that tells us a lot with this myth of, well, if you're independent, then you just weren't good enough to make it to the big houses. I think that's nice.
gestern direkt nochmal nachgefragt habe, ob das wirklich das meint, ne? Dieses eine Fünftel.
Well, I asked if that really means if that really means that a fifth.
Also ich würde eigentlich wirklich lieber gerne eine Anstellung haben.
That this fifth would really prefer to have a permanent employment basis.
Ich habe jetzt hier
But
aber auch nochmal aufgeschrieben,
what I also wrote down,
Auftrag, nächste Studie, welche Berufswege werden eigentlich eingeschlagen
didn't study
dem
what
Abschluss,
professional paths are actually crossed and pursued after graduation. But also as a key word, because this was asked about in the room as a demand, and perhaps was forgotten a little bit, but alongside the anchor in the individual curricula, there could also be a further education offering where, in an interdisciplinary manner, people could come together with an eye towards these organizational questions, insurance, where perhaps other cooperations could come together that are directed at younger members of the various communities. It was a suggestion that I would really like to throw back into this round of people, but with an eye toward the time, because we haven't only talked about the topic qualification, we also talked about other topics, like the KSK. I'd also like to ask, there's also the question of the limit of how much you can earn from non-artistic activities. Because in KSK, this is very problematic. How do you deal with this? If someone is in the KSK but is also formally employed from time to time, maybe you could remind us and tell us yesterday what was in your discussion? Sure. Okay. First of all, it's an incredibly complex topic. And because of its complexity, you can only see a small part of it. And there's definitely a need to come together and exchange individual experiences because of its complexity. And in this framework,
besagte Amphibienfahrzeuge, also die Hybridbeschäftigten,
talked about people who are only partly formally employed,
also sozusagen nicht eine Festanstellung
people
haben,
who
die vielleicht 1 oder 2 Jahre
are not
gehen
permanently
und dann
employed,
in eine Solo-Selbstständigkeit gehen,
but
1 oder 2 Jahre und dann wieder eine Fest. Das sozusagen
the problem wasn't even that people were formally employed for 1 or 2 years and they were freelance for 1 or 2 years. The problem was that people nearly at the same time were both formally employed, where they were authorized to give instructions, but also worked as artistically as independent freelancers.
Unterteilt sich dann natürlich sozusagen gleich wieder in, also wir haben diesen Fall von künstlerischer Solo-Selbstständigkeit und nicht
artistic freelance work and non-artistic freelance work. There are earning limits.
Sind wir sozusagen mit der Pandemie schon ordentlichen
And with the pandemic, we actually made a huge leap forward.
Stephan muss gleich einschränken. Und, also
or at least a step.
Sozusagen, aber gestern ging es vor allen Dingen um diese Frage von künstlerischer Solo-Selbstständigkeit und künstlerischer Erwerbstätigkeit, zum Beispiel das Beispiel einer
Here's an example, say an actor
Hörspiele produziert,
who works as a freelancer,
aber auch im Film
but
dreht.
is also formally employed. It's difficult because
ich habe lange gebraucht, das zu verstehen, weil sozusagen entweder wenn die Erwerbstätigkeit im Film zum Beispiel überwiegt, die Solo-Selbstständigen Einkünfte
if they earn more money from the formal employment, then they're allowed to, as an artistic freelancers, or the other way around.
Wenn sozusagen man den Schwerpunkt auf die Solo-Selbstständigkeit und die KSK-Mitgliedschaft
if the focus is placed on the independent work and the KSK, they always have to make sure that they don't earn too much in the formal employment situation. And this can't in any way, shape, or form be the sense of this rule. Lena? Sure. I've tried to think about this in my head the whole time, but yeah, this topic of KSK and the earning limits, what's the legislative development, Stephan? Okay, no, thank you.
Dass es da eine Anschlussregelung oder eine Änderung geben soll, die
there needs to be some kind of new regulation because of increased the earning limits.
Wo sozusagen eigentlich nur noch die Kriterien Hauptbeschäftigung
and then you should only have primary employment and secondary employment.
Ist dann sozusagen entscheidend mit Blick auf
with an eye towards the KSK. It sounds good, at least. We talked about this, the Allianz der Freien Künste, because in the field of the visual arts, we heard the alarm bells ringing. Because what is primary employment, what is secondary employment is only presented on an economic and financial basis. But to talk about the precarious income situation, that can become problematic. For example, in the visual arts, there were thoughts, if the income is so low, there was the consideration of whether this assessment of primary employment and secondary employment needs to be somehow supplemented by talking about how much time is spent on each of these. But the question is, how do you check that? How do you really verify how many hours you took to do this artistic work? And then we've got to keep our eyes on this. Okay, I'd like to say one word. You talked about working biographies yesterday, exemplary working biographies and work models, which in the definition of criteria and cases, we could perhaps work with. I think that's a very important aspect. Okay. Stephan wants to speak, and then Sören, and then we'll open up the room so that you and the audience can ask your own questions. Oh, it's okay. Lena covered that. I don't. Maybe just the sentence. With the people who work hybrid, they are always working artistically, but sometimes they're freelance and sometimes they are formally employed. And these two things create a lot of problems, and the apparatuses need to be changed to make this less complicated. And a non-artistic secondary form of earnings, that can either be freelance or formally employed. The point is for those who are working artistically, both freelance and on a permanent employment basis. And yeah, we've dealt with this point exactly as you so wonderfully described it. And the political options right there are probably limited right now, but maybe also I'll just add this quickly. The fact, the change, the lifting of the amount of money you're able to earn on the side came from the pandemic period. But this paper that the Allianz der Freien Künste wrote is a step-by-step guide for what the association should be demanding.
Das war jetzt sozusagen, ich will nochmal...
Okay, well, I'd like to say the opposite.
Seht ihr, wie
you see how complicated this is?
Ich bin da, als Kaya das eben beschrieben hat, ausgestiegen. Im Vorgespräch heute Morgen haben Heinrich und ich uns mal so ein paar, also Heinrich hat das mal alles...
This morning when Heinrich and I were talking, Heinrich listed all of it nice and cleanly, but it's so complex. But I immediately have this question, well, isn't this like a house that we built and we constantly make a little expansion, another little expansion, and at the end of the day it looks awful, just a combination of a billion different things. We wanted to make a house for ourselves, but it no longer fits, and we really need to change the relationships, because the entire construct is only there so that freelancers can be better safeguarded on a social basis, but not the wrong ones, the ones that really need it. And I think that this entire combination of, well, if this is, then that, then this, oh wait, but this, and then that, and if it is, ultimately leads to A, no one understands it, and B, there's tremendous legal insecurities, because the second that you try to stand on the foundations, they collapse. And then And then there's a post-payment claim of 10,000 euros for the ensemble, and I have to address this critique and say, no, people, all of these works around in construction, let's get rid of those. Instead of that, let's look. Okay, we have the category employed, we have the category freelance, but in overall society, we have freelancers who are not, let's say, potent enough to take care of themselves. We have things that are stuck in the middle. Okay, got it, thank you, understood. Now, we would really like to deal with the topic of definition. Which freelancers, which hybrids, which identities do have to be insured in which way? Because we had exactly this discussion yesterday. We have so many different cases. It's really our job to say, okay, how do we define them? How do we define freelance work in the artistic field? And now, Stephan and Kaya both said they'd like to speak. Kaya, you've got the microphone in your hand, go ahead. Sure, absolutely. Here's a real question, not rhetoric. Is it a good idea to shake these foundations? Sitting here as a production manager, somebody who works in Produktionsbande, every single day we have to deal with these legal uncertainties. And hopefully we're on the right side of the law, right side of the limit. But as a production manager, wouldn't it be good sometimes to simply ask and get some specific answers? Well, then we could go right to the audience with that. Because in our workshop yesterday, people vehemently said, no, don't ask for this, for this definition. Okay, one more sentence from Stephan. Yes, what I really wanted to make sure, Sören, first of all, I think you're absolutely right, but I'm also going to contradict you because I want to make a small differentiation. Some advocacy groups on the other side are very interested in getting rid of the KSK. And so if you are going to ask for definitions from the KFK, you have to be very careful. Because the KSK is keeping all of the freelancers, they're keeping all of the freelancers in a good situation. And we need to be careful that we don't endanger this as we are asking these questions. Maybe we could do it, we could find general solutions. And then many people, we said this before, production managers, if it's clear that they need to be paid better. Okay, great. Well, okay, we'll keep that in mind. Thank you very much. Be careful when you're asking for these clear answers. I want all of you to give a thought about what you'd like to say in the closing panel. And now you, dear audience, can ask your questions. Heinrich.
I
don't want to ask a question just because the whole time we've been talking about how necessary it is to be more precise in definitions and wordings. I just want to ask everyone to make sure that we're not just talking about the artistic field, the artistic discipline. We're talking about a field where a lot of people do work artistically, but also a number of people who work non-artistically. That's very important. Thank you very much. Yes, this really is relevant for overall society. And when we have precarious employment situations, it doesn't matter in what field we agreed yesterday that that's the direction we want to go in. Okay, please. I also don't have a question, but I want to add something. I want to say two things in terms of gray zones, gray areas. The gray area sometimes isn't so wrong, because if we do clearly regulate everything, there's so many individual cases. If we have these very specific specifications, they wouldn't work for a lot of people. So let's just think about that. These gray zones allow a lot more people to be covered.
Und da würde ich dir recht geben, Sören, natürlich damit zu tun, dass ich auch der Meinung bin, wir haben ein Haus.
And I'm also thinking of a house that we just keep adding to and adding to and adding to, but when we talk about qualification the entire time and how it needs to be changed, well, I would say, well, from an overall societal standpoint, there's still the consensus, but that the better alternative is permanent employment, and that's probably still addressed the same way in the educational institutions, because then you're socially safeguarded. If we want, in parallel, to set permanent employment and freelance employment the same, then we won't have this problem in overall society anymore, and probably not also in terms of qualification. But this is exactly the core of the question, the heart of the matter. Yep, everybody's nodding.
Das Interessante ist ja, dass das Unternehmerische oder das Selbstständige tatsächlich nur im privatwirtschaftlichen Kontext.
Well, so freelancers are only working in a private economic context that's only supported and recognized there. But that is an interim area that needs to be taken into account. And I think the topic of gray areas, I heard this from Kaya as well. We actually have to get the most out of what we have. That's exactly what you're talking about. Not just, but.
Auch so.
Jetzt no, is there? Okay.
Gab's irgendwann? Nee. Dann weitere Meldungen bitte.
Hi, I'm Heinrich.
Heinrich.
I'll be on the final panel soon too. I want to take the lobbying work in this direction. It's a strategic question. Stephan, we talked about this yesterday in the workshops. It's important that we have long-term goals that we want to achieve and what models we want to get to. But Sören, what you said, the house is built and added on. It's a strange house. Yeah, that's true. We live in that. But please bear in mind what can be done very quickly with legislation is to get rid of things. That's what lawmakers can do. Getting rid of the Kaska, that's quick. Yeah. Getting rid of other sort of strange regulations do help people, that's very quick. But what takes a longer time, like an open heart operation, to make these things better. And Sören, my thesis is we cannot avoid to continue building this house until there are clear rules. And if we're too impatient, we say, no, we've got to do something right now, get rid of everything. Sure, it's easy to get rid of things, but what will be created for us, what will be fair for us, that will be even more difficult. Okay, so you're saying, please keep building on the house. Yes, I think we should definitely keep building on this house. That's my opinion.
Dann brauchen wir Wegweiser, die da durchführen, sozusagen. Okay, aber das haben wir ja heute auch schon. So.
Okay, Sören and Lena. All right. Well, maybe we can let the house stay standing. We can start a new house next door to it and try to make sure that the new house is a little bit clearer. I think also you need to make sure that we don't destroy anything. As long as it works, don't touch it. But I do think we still, if you say long term, sure, at some point we need to prepare for something new. And I don't think that's going to be destructive. Thanks, Sören. Lena, then Anna. Well, to stay with this metaphor of the house, my impulse is there's a lot in between complete demolition and building something brand new. There's still the option of changing what exists and renovating it. And I think For example, the phrase citizen insurance. Maybe we don't have political strength on the federal level right now, that the citizens insurance is going to come, it's not in the coalition agreement, there are parties that are against it, whereas the SPD and the Greens already have plans, but okay. Great, citizens insurance, well, that's not something we need to waste time on right now because that's not an option right now, but what can happen on the way to getting there? I think that is good, and that's exactly what we should look into. We should look at this house and say, okay, well, what sort of changes can we make by changing what we already have? I hope that there are opportunities and chances in there to make changes step by step, because I also don't think the answer is to demolish everything. Then things are simply forgotten. Okay, sure, I'd like to jump there too, and I'd like to stay with this metaphor as well. I'm thinking about this presentation on Friday about sustainability in the cultural community, and somebody from Landmark Preservations had something to say and said we need to move from the maximum principle to the minimum principle, and to always ask, what do I need for minimal definitions to achieve a maximum openness? This could be an exciting way. I just thought of that with this wonderful metaphor. And here's someone else who wants to speak. Hi. I also don't have a question. We are collecting knowledge. Thanks. My comment.
Können Sie ein bisschen lauter sprechen? Dann kommt also ins Mikro rein.
Okay. Also und zwar wollte ich eine Lanze brechen für große Bündnisse, Arbeitsverhältnisse zu verbessern. Ich glaube,
I think Anne-Schneider said before, even though I know that freelance work is a very heterogeneous field, I'm here right now as someone who works as a freelancer in Leipzig, but also deal with freelance work in adult education. I also am familiar with the performing arts, but also read about the other topics. I thought, okay, there's so many similar topics. For example, qualification. If I talk with other teachers, they also they don't really know what their course of study will bring them, and didn't know at all about the business requirements that would come and how to safeguard themselves. A quarter of the instructors don't have pension insurance, and these low fees as a result of lower public funding. It's a huge topic in this area. And need the minimum fee limits need to be incorporated into the project applications, and this made so many people excited, and I just wanted to speak out for big actions and big alliances. Oh, we'll definitely take that thought along with us. So Kaya, yeah, the big alliances are not only in art and culture, you can also see them, so for example, adult education, of course, in the social areas, anywhere where there's public funding, and where we can make the state in a certain way responsible. Yeah, I think I can maybe start the round with this closing statement, because that yesterday in our workshop, that was a gigantic topic. We need solutions for everybody. We have an overall societal demand on politicians. It can't be that people work for their entire lives and have no social safety net. I thought that was a nice keyword to keep in mind. Yes, broad-based alliances. Thank you. Okay. Are there any more questions? Otherwise, we'll start the final round. Thank you so much for your participation. And Anna, then I'll turn the word over to you. The idea Sören was just diligently taking notes and getting himself ready. So, Sören, should we start with you? The question is, what do you want us to keep in mind for the final discussion? Okay. I think the old Bismarckian, Janina Benduski said, the old Bismarckian idea of the freelance employment, as it's still done today, is outdated, anachronistic. And the pandemic showed us this. With home office, and that all at once, people could continue to work unsupervised at home, astonishingly. It showed this anachronism. And there's a certain recognition that grew in society. And I think we have to look where and how we take this kind of freelance work and the workplace. How can we add these two things to each other? And how do we do this? Well, through a mutual social safeguarding. Whether or not that's in the governing coalition's agreement, if we achieve this goal, it'll solve a whole lot of the problems. And until we have done so, of course, we need these auxiliary constructions and can't destroy them. But when we work, we need to bear in mind that we're not only demanding these things for us artists, but for everyone. And creating broad alliances with everyone who is effective, who have the same problems. Lena. Great, I can take up from there. I'm not entirely certain who's in the final panel, but I think with all these questions for better social safeguarding, I have two questions in my head. I'd love to get a hand on for the final round. The first, in recent weeks, were discussions about better social safeguarding. In my context, we need some kind of unemployment insurance for freelancers. I think for strategic reasons, we should deal with it differently, and I'm very excited about people's opinions in the final round. I think, first of all, we should make sure that we have something set up for temporary lacks of income. You could call it furlough pay for freelancers. So in classic music or old music, we really have our biggest earning periods at Christmas and Easter when people go to churches, and of course a lot of that will fall away with the pandemic. We have temporary lack of income that has nothing to do with the individual responsibility of artists. I think that's what we need first and foremost as a safeguarding system. And right now we do not have. There are suggestions. The German Kulturrat has these. We've heard from a bunch of experts, but still, there was the strategically not so wise move of talking about unemployment insurance, but also we have an idea for a temporary loss of income. And I think it would be great if we turn that around and say, no, the first point we want to talk about dealing with temporary losses of income, and then in parallel, as you said at the beginning, if you ask me, and every single kind of socio-political claim is going to fall on its face if we don't manage to raise the fees.
Was ja auch oft passiert ist im Sinne von, dass dann so eine Haltung kommt, naja, eine Absicherung für einkommensniedrigere Zeiten, ähnliches wird ja eh nicht funktionieren, weil ich so wenig verdiene. Das stimmt.
We have to keep both of these things in mind. Even if somebody says, yeah, well, if this program comes in, it won't work for me because I don't earn enough money, we have to keep both goals in mind. Okay, so the demand now that comes to the BFDK, the BFDK, yesterday, we also said, okay, what are the demands that we want to place for the Allianz as well as the BFDK? Auftragslosigkeit. And now, Lena, you'd like to say, I'd forget the question, but yeah, but I'm absolutely for overall societal solutions, but
Das heißt ja aber trotzdem, wir könnten die Gesamtgesellschaft
But we can also realize this overall solution via the KSK, because health insurance is also an overall societal concern. But we can deal with that via the KSK. And that's also a discussion, and I'd love to, yes, an expansion of the professional fields would help that. Thank you, Lena. Stephan.
Stephan.
Lena, zeigt sich wieder mal, dass wir...
Zweiteile. Ich habe das eben geschlappert. Du wolltest kurz was noch sagen.
No, I just wanted to talk about my final point.
Jetzt nutzen. Ich hatte ja das Privileg, dass ich vorhin schon was sagen konnte.
I'll be quick.
Ich mich kurz merke, dass wir gut...
But Lena and I, we know each other well because we have similar points. But I want to talk about the minimum fee limits. Again, I want to say a little bit more. Because there's a process.
Und da ist quasi dieses Möglichkeitsfenster, von dem Lisa gestern gesprochen hat, ist gerade offen.
There's an opportunity
über die Länder. Und insofern ist es ein Auftrag
within
an
the
den
states,
Bundesverband, an die Allianz, eigentlich auch an den Kulturrat.
for the Allianz, the Bundesverband, as well as the Kulturrat,
sind, dass die wenig Fokus auf die
who look at people who work independently.
freien Arbeit haben. Da jetzt sozusagen frontal in diesem Möglichkeitsfenster einfach die Arbeitspraxis der Freien.
We need to present the working practices of the independents right now while this opportunity is open. That was my supplement. And the second point was the answer to the question. Yes. Yep. Unemployment insurance. We dealt with that also yesterday as a topic. And we actually wanted to formulate a question for system check, exactly this point, where the speakers both had comprehensive concepts to unemployment insurance. But both of them had problems defining what exactly is the insured event. Is it a lack of jobs? Is it a temporary lack of income? And both of these concepts could be looked at within System Check with academic support, whether it's a function of the KSK or in general for everyone. But if System Check could develop a definition, what the actual insured event is, I think a great deal of definition work that could be confused could be conducted and be solved. And we could create a kind of role model that System Check could then create guidelines to present to the Federal Ministry of Employment. I'd like to return to the point that Lena addressed, that the question of fees and financing, later that affects the safeguarding and the time without earning money. And even if times aren't easy right now, there's definitely, thanks to the pandemic, there's now a window of opportunity that's open where we can talk and address. And we have to take it upon ourselves in the associations, also in the direction of the politicians. We need to address this. We can't go to the individual actors. We need to... I'll switch roles for a minute as somebody who operates a venue. What happens if the fees are higher, but the budgets of the institutions, the houses, the venues don't raise? The question is, we also have to look with an eye to a lack of qualified personnel alongside the other important topics of pension insurance and the KSK, but there's still the never-ending story. We need a better safeguarding and fee system. We have to talk about redistribution, and not redistribution between the permanently employed and the freelancers, but from other fields and areas. We cannot fail to pursue this. I want to add one more thing. We've cultural legislation since the beginning of this year, and then there's exactly this question. Yes, less is done. As soon as you are represented legally, less is done. But this also means more people have less work. There's going to be more times of less earning or no earning. Sorry, I don't want to add a new discussion in the closing words, but yes, it's true. But there are also counterexamples. For example,
zum Beispiel in Berlin hat die Honoraruntergrenze zugegebenermaßen in wirtschaftlich besseren Zeiten über Jahre hinweg zu Aufwüchsen in den Etats.
But Berlin has increased its funding for years and years, and this is the point. If we deal with legal security, we also have to look what kind of consequences will this have, and just a sentence before I get to my point, to the question of the minimum fee limits or the fees. If we realize that we cannot realize permanent employment, what kind of alarm signal is that if we can't afford to safeguard people? How in the world are they supposed to safeguard themselves with that same money on a freelance basis? Okay, and now, to build upon what Sören said, if we see the creative field and the independent performing arts as an area that can be developed with a relevance to the overall social situation, and if it always shows up in our field first,
also im Anschluss an Creative Class und bla bla bla, Florida, kennt ihr alle, dann können, warum
why don't we start right there? And now here we need solutions that are already there, so when we really arrive there as an overall society, I think now it's a little bit late for this, but I could imagine, but...
ich könnte mir vorstellen, dass es noch sozusagen als Argumentationsstrang
and
funktioniert.
one final sentence to this Produktionsbande. To reform the KSK,
zu reformieren oder die
or to
so zu
change the
bauen, dass
KSK
globale Absicherung passiert,
so that it serves everybody, it still wouldn't be sufficient for the entire field. We're working in a field. Let me just finish.
Nur einmal ganz kurz in der Klarheit, wir sind als Feld
It's not only artists that are working in this field, but a whole bunch of other people, like the production managers. And the production managers simply have a good lobby and talk very loudly, but there are a bunch of other people, like, for example, technicians. And then there's a lack of qualified personnel. Okay? Yep, but we're not going to talk about that. Anna, you've got more than enough topics, I think. This wonderful panel. So here, I'd like to give you my warmest thanks. Stephan Behrmann, Lena Krause.
Bei Lena Krause, Sören, Entschuldigung, Stephan Behrmann, jetzt bin ich habe langsam
Sören Fenner.
Also, Sören Fenner.
Ich nehme auch deinen Job.
Nee. Ja, genau, das war
Lena Krause,
genau die Strategie gerade. Ne? Lena Krause,
Anna Naturalist Co-Moderator, Stephan Behrmann, Anne-Cathrin Lessel, and
dann Anne-Cathrin
Kaya Jakze.
und Kaya Jakze.